My name is Vincent. I am 34 years old, the founder of Avon Logistics in Seattle, and a woman who learned very early that if you want a fortress, you have to bake the bricks yourself. My parents erased me from their lives for 7 years, acting like I never existed. Then one morning, they walked into my company. My dad slammed papers down demanding I sign over 35% or face a lawsuit. I just smiled, picked up the phone, and called security. But before I tell you about the silence in that boardroom, you need to understand the sound that preceded it. It was Tuesday night, 3:07 a.m. in Hartford. The sound wasn't a bang. It was a heavy, rhythmic thud-thud-thud of water meeting drywall. I woke up to a ceiling that was breathing. Within seconds, it was weeping. Then it was simply collapsing. A main pipe in my upstairs neighbor's unit had burst. I remember the smell of old, wet insulation, that heavy metallic scent of a building's guts being spilled. I grabbed Mia, who was 5 at the time, and shoved her into a raincoat over her pajamas. We stood in the hallway of a building that was no longer a home, watching gray, icy water soak into the only 2 bags I managed to pack. I didn't call for money. I didn't call for a handout. I called for a dry floor for my daughter to sleep on. My father's house was 10 minutes away, a sprawling 4-bedroom colonial with 3 empty guest rooms. I called 4 times before Corvin answered. I could hear the silence of his house on the other end, that expensive, climate-controlled silence that I had helped pay for since I was 21. "Vincent, it's 3 in the morning," he said. His voice was flat, the same tone he used when discussing a late mail delivery or a mild annoyance with the gardener. He didn't ask if we were safe. He didn't ask why Mia was shivering so hard I could hear her teeth clicking. "The apartment is flooded, Dad," I said, trying to keep my voice as level as his. The ceiling came down. "Mia is freezing. Can we just crash on your sofa for the night? Just until the sun comes up." There was a pause. I could almost hear him weighing the cost of his daughter against the comfort of his furniture. "We just had the white wool rugs replaced in the living room yesterday," he said finally. "The fibers haven't even settled. You can't bring a wet child in those moldy bags in here, Vincent. Besides, Zinnia is staying over in the blue guest room, and you know she's sensitive to damp air. It triggers her allergies. It would be irresponsible of me to put her at risk." "Dad, it's raining. We have nowhere to go." "This house isn't a warehouse for your disasters, Vincent," he replied. "Find a hotel. You've always been the strong one, the one who never needed anyone. This is a good time to prove it." He hung up. "No, stay safe. No, call me when you find a place." Just the dial tone, which sounded a lot like a final verdict. He told me the wool rugs were worth more than our warmth. He told me that my sister's comfort was a priority, while my survival was a chore. I stood in the rain outside the apartment complex, the water soaking through my sneakers. I didn't call him back. I didn't beg. I realized in that moment that I hadn't been forgotten. I had been managed. I was a line item that had become too expensive for his ledger. I pulled out my phone and opened my banking app. I had $312 in my savings. I booked a room at the Marriott near the airport for $285. It was practically everything I had, but the price of dignity has always been high. When the rideshare dropped us off, the night clerk, a man with tired eyes and a name tag that read James, didn't ask for my life story. He saw a soaked mother and a shivering child. He grabbed a warm towel from the bin behind him and handed it to Mia before I even finished checking in. "I saw the weather report," he said quietly. "Take your time. Breakfast is at 6. A stranger gave us a towel. My father gave us a cold shoulder. That rainy Tuesday night turned me from a daughter into a ghost. It was the night I realized that the people who share your blood aren't always the ones who share your burden. As I sat on the edge of that hotel bed, Watching Mia finally fall into a fitful sleep, I felt a strange, chilling clarity. I opened my phone again. I canceled the $200 recurring transfer I sent to my mother every month for her gardening club. I disabled the auto pay for my father's Netflix and Amazon accounts. I went through my contact list and blocked Corvin, Narina, and Zinnia. I deleted the family group chat. The silence that followed didn't feel lonely. It felt like the first breath of oxygen after drowning. There is a specific kind of peace that comes when you stop negotiating with people who don't love you. I spent 7 years building a life they couldn't touch. I moved to Seattle. I worked 80-hour weeks. I built Avon Logistics from a laptop in a studio apartment into a firm that manages the supply chains of half the West Coast. I thought the silence was a permanent shield. I thought that by becoming a ghost, I had finally become safe. But fate has a wicked sense of humor. 7 years later, the elevator doors of my headquarters opened. My father walked out in a tailored suit, looking like a man who had never seen a wet wool rug in his life. He walked into my office as if he had built the walls himself. He didn't see the woman who had shivered in a hotel lobby. He saw a company worth $30 million. And he brought a manila envelope full of demands to remind me that in his world, I would always be his most valuable asset, as long as he could steal it. The man who valued a rug over his grandchild walked in like he owned the sky. He had no idea that while he was erasing me, I was learning how to rewrite the ending. Now, let me take you back to the winter of 2012 in Boston, Massachusetts. The air there was a different kind of cold than the mist of Seattle. It was sharp, biting, and heavy with the smell of fireplace soot and old, damp brick. To understand how a father could let his daughter stand in a flood 7 years later, it is necessary to see the leaderboard we lived by. In our house on Commonwealth Avenue, love was not a gift. It was a ranked resource, managed by Corvin with the cold precision of an auditor. Corvin was the self-appointed judge of our worth. Narina was his stenographer, a woman who spent her days rewriting our family history to fit his shifting moods. And then there was Zinnia, my older sister. She was the masterpiece. She was delicate and visionary, which in our family's dialect meant she was chronically unemployed and incredibly expensive. I was simply durable and practical. My name, Vincent, a name Corvin chose because he had expected a son to carry his legacy, became a brand for my utility. Zinnia was a dream to be protected. I was a tool to be utilized. She was celebrated. I was managed. The patterns were established in the small things, the way cracks in a foundation start before the house leans. In May of 2012, I graduated with honors in logistics and supply chain management. It was a rigorous program, one I'd worked 3 separate part-time jobs to fund, while maintaining a GPA that stayed strictly in the top 5%. On graduation day, I stood in the heat of the commencement plaza, searching the crowd of caps and gowns for my family. They arrived 40 minutes late. Corvin and Narina walked toward me just as the ceremony was dispersing, their faces free of any hint of apology. Zinnia followed behind, draped in an oversized silk scarf, looking exhausted. Zinnia had a creative block regarding her outfit for the gallery opening tonight, Narina explained, adjusting her pearls as if she were the one who had suffered a great ordeal. We had to stop at 3 different boutiques to find the right shade of teal. You know how sensitive her process is. Corvin didn't look at my diploma. He didn't ask about my honors cord. He looked at the medal around my neck and then at his watch. Good, he said, his voice flat. Now that you've finished this, you can get a real job and start helping your sister with her studio rent in the seaport. She's at a critical stage in her portfolio, and we can't have her distracted by something as mundane as a utility bill. I gripped the edge of my leather-bound diploma folder until the skin on my knuckles went white. I told myself it was fine. Zinnia was the artist. Artists were fragile. I was the strong one. I could handle the extra weight because my shoulders were built for it. I swallowed the feeling that I was just a human insurance policy for my sister's whims. 6 months later, the structure of our family shifted from subtle neglect to a quiet, clinical erasure. I had landed a final round interview with a major logistics firm in Seattle, the job that would eventually become the seed for Avon Logistics. I flew back to Boston for a weekend to pick up my birth certificate, passport, and the original copies of my academic transcripts from my childhood bedroom. When I pushed open the door to my room, the air that met me was different. It was filtered, climate-controlled, and smelled faintly of expensive leather and cedarwood. My bed was gone. My desk, where I had spent years studying under a dim lamp while Zinnia slept through her morning classes, was nowhere to be seen. The walls had been repainted from a warm beige to a soft, sterile ivory. The room had been converted into a high-end walk-in closet for Zinnia's collection. Rows of designer handbags sat on custom-built glass shelves, illuminated by recessed LED lighting. Each bag was positioned like an artifact in a museum. I began to move the bags, looking for any sign of my life. In the corner, on the bottom shelf, I saw a familiar designer tote, a gift I'd bought for Zinnia with my first real paycheck. It looked unusually bulky. I reached inside and pulled out the stuffing. It wasn't tissue paper. It was my university degree. The heavy, cream-colored vellum I had worked 3 jobs to earn had been folded and shoved into the bag to help it keep its shape. My trophies from the debate team and track were being used as makeshift dividers for her clutch purses, their gold-plated figures peeking out from behind layers of calfskin and lambskin. I walked into the kitchen where Narina was sipping Earl Grey, her eyes fixed on a home renovation magazine. "Where is my bed, Mom?" I asked. My voice was quiet, lacking the volume of an accusation. She didn't look up from a photograph of a marble kitchen island. "We didn't think you'd mind, Vincent. You're never here anyway." And Zinnia's leather collection was starting to suffer from the humidity in the basement. "Her art is an investment for the whole family. You're so low maintenance. We knew you'd understand. You've always been so good at making do." I stood in the ivory-colored shrine to my sister's vanity and told myself it was logical. I was moving to Seattle. I didn't need a room. Zinnia needed the aesthetic environment for her mental health. If I was as strong as Corvin said I was, then I didn't need a bed in a house where I was only a guest. I packed what remained of my documents into a single suitcase and left Boston the next morning. The weight of being the strong one is that no one ever checks to see if you're carrying too much. They just keep piling on the stones, confident that you won't break until the day you finally do. I left with a bitter taste in my mouth, thinking I had escaped the worst of their entitlement. I thought that by moving 3,000 miles away, I could finally stop being a tool and start being a person. But the ranking system was more than just a preference for the golden child. It was a blueprint for a larger heist. I didn't know then that the favoritism wasn't just emotional. It was structural. And Corvin had been preparing the ledger long before I ever stepped on that plane. The bill for my existence was about to come due, and the price was higher than I could have ever imagined. After I moved to Seattle in 2014, the screaming stopped. The atmosphere changed from the sharp, biting frost of Boston to a strange, humid warmth. Corvin began sending good morning texts with scenery photos. Narina started calling twice a week, her voice thick with a maternal softness I hadn't heard since I was a toddler. When Mia was born a year later, the interest intensified. They wanted photos of her nursery, the name of her pediatrician, the layout of my new apartment in Queen Anne. At the time, I mistook interrogation for interest. Silence, I thought, was finally being replaced by healing. I didn't see the strategy behind the questions. They remembered every detail: the date of my quarterly bonuses, the name of my chief legal officer, Kyle, and the exact floor of my office in Bellevue. I was hungry to be seen, to finally prove that the practical, durable daughter had made something of herself. I fed them every win, every promotion, every decimal point of growth. I thought I was building a bridge. I didn't know I was just providing them with the ammunition they needed to calculate exactly how much they could take. The transition from words to currency began in the spring of 2016. It was a Tuesday evening, the kind of quiet Pacific Northwest night where the rain feels more like a curtain than a storm. Corvin called. His voice was hushed, conspiratorial. "Vincent," he said, "Zinnia is in a bit of a bind. Her artistic sanctuary loft in the seaport is short on the security deposit for the new exhibition space. Just $800. Only for a month, until her grant clears. Just this once, could you help your sister stay on her feet? You know she doesn't have your head for numbers." I remember the light of my laptop screen reflecting off my glass coffee table as I opened my bank app. My hand shook slightly when I tapped the send button. It wasn't fear. It was a desperate, soaring pride. For the first time, I wasn't the burden or the tool. I was the savior. I was the one with the capability they lacked. But just this once is a lie that parasites tell to keep the host from flinching. $800 became a $1,200 recurring monthly transfer for studio maintenance. By 2017, the transfers were automatic. I labeled the folder in my banking app, Family Support. Corvin and Narina simply called it, Your Responsibility. The ladder of escalation was built with surgical precision. Step 1 was the monthly Zinnia Fund. Step 2 was Corvin's investment gap, a $5,000 check to cover a failed real estate flip he'd hidden from the neighbors. Step 3 was Narina's gardening club, which I later found out was a euphemism for high-end boutique shopping trips. The most revealing rung on that ladder, however, was the silence. When Mia had a high fever, or when I had a minor car accident that left me with a $2,000 deductible, I would mention it on our weekly calls. There was never an offer to help, never a, "Do you need anything?" There was only a pause, followed by Narina asking if the family support transfer would be delayed because of my unfortunate spending. I began keeping a spreadsheet. It was a cold, clinical habit born of my training in logistics. Column A, date. Column B, amount. Column C, reason. Column D, response. Most of column D was a desert of empty cells. By the end of 2018, the total at the bottom of the sheet sat at $218,450. It was a shock number, a digital monument to my own desire to be loved. One afternoon, Narina called to thank me for a bonus payment I'd shared with them. "You're so lucky, Vincent," she said, her voice sounding like a soft pat on the head. "You aren't emotional or sensitive like Zinnia. You can just work and ignore the stress. You were born to be a provider. It's your nature." It was a compliment laced with hemlock. She was telling me that my value was tied to my output, and that my lack of sensitivity was a convenient excuse to never offer me a hand in return. The reckoning didn't come in a courtroom. It came in a hotel room. After the 2019 flood in Hartford, after I stood in that lobby and realized a wool rug had more value to my father than my daughter's health, I cut the wires. I stopped every recurring payment. I blocked the accounts. I thought the silence would be my shield. The response was an email. It arrived 3 days after the flood, sent from Corvin's official address. No greeting. No, "I hope Mia is okay." Effective immediately, it read, "Do not use our Commonwealth Avenue address for any legal, professional, or postal filings. I have filed a formal notice with the USPS and the county clerk that you no longer reside here. You are dead to this family. Do not attempt to contact us. We have erased you from the ledger." I was sitting on the edge of the hotel bed when I read it. The room was quiet. I felt a weight lift, but beneath it was a cold, hard stone. I called Cale, my legal officer. "Run a deep credit audit," I said. "Check everything. Social Security, Old accounts, everything. 2 hours later, Cale called back. His voice was tightly controlled. "Vincent, we found a high-interest business loan for $50,000. It was taken out 16 months ago for a boutique called Zinnia's Bloom. You're the primary co-signer." "I never signed for a boutique, Cale." "I know. I'm looking at the digital signature on the PDF. It was executed during your Christmas visit to Boston. The metadata shows it was signed from your father's desktop computer using your saved login credentials. He forged it, Vincent." I didn't scream. I didn't even cry. I sat in the dim light of a budget hotel and looked at the spreadsheet on my screen. I hadn't just given them money. I had handed them the keys to my identity, the bricks of my fortress, and the very air I breathed. I had given them the bullets and stood perfectly still while they aimed at my heart, believing that if I just bled enough, they might finally tell me I was worth it. They didn't just want me to disappear. They wanted me to pay for the privilege of being erased. As the sun rose over Hartford, I closed the laptop. I had spent years being the practical daughter. It was time to show them exactly how practical I could be, when the only thing left to manage was the fallout. November 14th, 2019. That was the night the world didn't just crack open. It froze. At 4:12 a.m., I was sitting in a molded plastic chair in the pediatric emergency wing of Hartford Hospital. The air in the ward was thick with the scent of industrial-strength bleach and the metallic hum of the ventilation system. Outside, the rain had turned into a sleet that rattled against the glass like handfuls of gravel. Inside, the only sound was the rhythmic, lonely beep, beep, beep of the vitals monitor. Mia wasn't just wet from the flood anymore. When the paramedics lifted her from the hallway of our collapsed apartment, her core temperature had plummeted to 94 degrees. Hypothermia. I can still feel the sensation of her small hand in mine. Blue-tinted, waxy, and so cold it felt like holding a piece of river stone. The nurse had wrapped her in a forced air warming blanket, a silver and white shroud that hissed as it pumped heat into her tiny frame. I watched the IV drip, a slow, translucent tick of medicine. In that moment, the identity I had worn for 30 years, the practical daughter, the one who fixed things, the one who understood, began to slough off like dead skin. I didn't feel like a daughter. I felt like a surveyor assessing a site that had been condemned. To never be in this position again, I couldn't just have a job. I had to own the system that controlled the resources. At 5:15 a.m., the pressure intensified. My final interview and presentation for the Seattle executive transfer was scheduled for 8 a.m. at my firm's regional headquarters. It was the culmination of 3 years of 80-hour weeks and missed holidays. If I made it to that boardroom, we had a future in a city where the ceilings didn't collapse. If I missed it, the promotion would vanish into the hands of a colleague who hadn't spent his night in an ER. I had exactly 2 hours and 45 minutes to find someone to sit with Mia so I could change my clothes and present my life's work. I didn't ask for a kidney. I didn't ask for money. I just asked for 2 hours of time. I opened the Callaway family group chat. My fingers were stiff, but my mind was a cold, high-speed processor. Mia is in the ER hypothermia from the flood. I have my final Seattle board presentation at 8 a.m. Please, can someone come sit with her until 10? I have no one else. I watched the scene icons appear at the bottom of the thread. Narina was the first to reply at 5:19 a.m. Vincent, we are already at the gate for the Sedona flight. Corvin's anniversary surprise. The tickets are non-refundable and we're boarding in 20 minutes. You always choose the most dramatic times to have a crisis. Be the strong one we raised you to be and figure it out. Zinnia followed a minute later. Seriously? It's just a chill. Give her some tea. We've been planning this trip for months. Don't be a burden today of all days. Scene 5:22 a.m. I stared at the screen. the blue light reflected in the glass of the vitals monitor. I didn't feel anger. I felt a profound, chilling sense of math. They had calculated the value of a non-refundable flight against the warmth of their own grandchild, and the grandchild had lost. "Is everything okay?" I looked up. Nurse Sarah was adjusting Mia's IV line. She had seen the screen. She had seen the emojis and the scene timestamps. She stood there for a moment, her hand resting on the bed rail, her eyes meeting mine with a clarity that the people in my group chat would never possess. She didn't offer a platitude. She just reached out and squeezed my shoulder, a firm, grounding pressure that lasted 3 seconds. Her silence was louder than their excuses. "I saw it," she whispered. "Focus on her. I'll make sure the intake logs are noted." I took a breath, the cold hospital air filling my lungs. I asked for a printout of the paperwork. Document 1. Pediatric ER Intake Form number HH-2019-882. Document 2. The police report from the apartment flood, filed by Officer Vance, badge number 402. Document 3. A timestamped screenshot of the family thread. I didn't call them back. I didn't beg. Instead, I pulled up my browser and searched for elite nursing solutions. I told the dispatcher I needed a private, board-certified RN for 4 hours, bedside, starting immediately. It was a triple-rate emergency call. $600, the absolute limit of my last credit card. It was worth every penny. At 6:45 a.m., a professional nurse in navy scrubs walked into the ward. She was efficient, calm, and carried a clipboard like a shield. I handed her Mia's favorite worn teddy bear and the ER discharge instructions. I gave her Kale's number as my secondary emergency contact. I walked out of that hospital as the sun began to bleed a pale, sickly yellow over the Hartford skyline. I stopped at a gas station 3 blocks from the office, changed into my best navy suit in a bathroom that smelled of pine cleaner, and pinned my hair into a tight, professional knot. I arrived at the headquarters at 7:52 a.m. I stood in the elevator, looking at my reflection in the brushed steel. My eyes were red-rimmed, but my posture was a steel cable. I gave the best presentation of my career. I spoke about logistics, efficiency, and the management of unavoidable risks. I didn't mention the flood. I didn't mention the hospital. By 10:30 a.m., I had the signed offer for the Seattle position. Strangers showed up. My family didn't. They chose a wool rug and a Sedona sunset over a freezing child. That was the day I stopped being a victim and started being the architect of their downfall. I realized that my family hadn't just forgotten me. They had erased the part of me that had a right to be cared for. 3 days later, Mia and I were on a one-way flight to Seattle. I didn't leave a note. I didn't send a text. I just listened to the quiet, roaring sound of the jet engines as the bridge behind me burned into ash. The sadness was gone. Only the blueprint remained. The first morning in Seattle felt like a clean slate written on cold glass. We were in a sparse studio apartment in Queen Anne, a space so quiet it felt sacred. The air smelled of cedar-heavy rain and the chemical tang of cheap floor wax. Mia was asleep on a twin mattress on the floor, the only piece of furniture we owned besides 3 cardboard boxes and a refurbished laptop. I sat on one of those boxes, watching the faint, yellowing bruise on Mia's arm where the IV had been just 48 hours ago. My coffee was cold, the condensation on the paper cup forming a ring of dampness on the cardboard. In the distance, the Seattle monorail hummed, a rhythmic vibration that didn't know my name, my history, or my supposed debts. It was a neutral sound, a free sound. In that stillness, the survival instinct that had kept me upright in Hartford morphed into something more structural. I looked at my reflection in the dark window, framed by the city lights. I didn't see a daughter or a scapegoat. I saw an architect. A pivot occurred in my mind, a short, sharp calculation that would define the next decade. Stop bleeding. Or stop breathing. If the table you're sitting at doesn't have a place card for you, you don't beg for a seat. You leave the room and you build your own house. I opened the refurbished laptop. The screen flickered to life, the blue light casting long shadows across the empty room. I logged into my banking app. I didn't look at the balance. I looked at the scheduled transfers. There they were, the digital leeches I had allowed to drain my future for years. $1,200 for Zinnia's artistic support. $500 for Dad's investment gap. $300 for Mom's gardening club. It wasn't just money. It was a ransom I had been paying for a love that was never going to be delivered. I began the process with a clinical hand. Click. Cancel. Zinnia's rent support. Click. Cancel. Corvin's Gap Fund. Click. Stop. Narina's monthly allowance. I changed my bank passwords. I enabled two-factor authentication using a new Seattle-based phone number. I went to the family group chat, the one where the scene icons had left me in a hospital hallway, and I hit exit. Then I deleted the thread. Finally, I blocked their numbers. Each action was a brick being laid in a new wall. There were no tears, no dramatic goodbye speeches whispered into a void. It felt like finally setting down a heavy, waterlogged coat I'd been forced to wear for 30 years. The silence didn't hurt. It healed. A quiet knock at the door broke my focus. It was Elias, a colleague from the firm I'd just joined. He was carrying a spare space heater and a brown paper bag of groceries. "You look like you haven't slept since the Clinton administration," he said, stepping into the room and setting the bag on a box. "I brought some essentials. And some actual coffee." He handed me a thermos. The warmth felt real. He didn't ask about the lack of furniture or why I'd moved across the country with a child and 2 suitcases. He just looked at me and asked, "How are you, really?" I took a sip of the coffee. "Better," I said. It was the first time I'd spoken the truth in years. For the first time in my life, I don't owe anyone an explanation for my existence. Between 2020 and 2025, the static became my sanctuary. The climb was steep, built on 4-hour nights and double shifts at the logistics firm. By 2022, I had founded Avon Logistics. I started with one small warehouse in Tacoma and a belief that efficiency is the only thing that doesn't lie to you. By 2024, the revenue had hit 8 figures, and I hired Kale as my chief legal officer. I kept a physical memento of the night the truth froze. Mia's pink plastic hospital bracelet sat in the top drawer of my mahogany desk in Bellevue. Every time I negotiated a multi-million-dollar contract, every time I secured a new fleet, I would touch that plastic. It was my anchor. It reminded me that the people who value wool rugs over lives are not people you negotiate with. They are people you outbuild. I didn't just move. I vanished. I didn't send postcards. I didn't check Zinnia's social media to see which designer bag my former salary had purchased. I became a ghost with a high-speed internet connection and a growing market share. I was strategic about the silence. I knew the fallout was coming. I knew that in the ranking system of the Calloway family, they would notice the disappearance of the money long before they noticed the disappearance of the daughter. I was waiting for the moment they would realize that the convenient tool had transformed into a powerful stranger. You cannot fix a foundation that was built to fail. You can only let the old structure collapse and ensure you aren't standing under it when it does. As the sage once noted, the best revenge is not to be like your enemy. I chose to be something they couldn't even categorize. The static protected me for 7 years. I thought I had reached a height where their voices couldn't reach. But 7 years later, the executive elevator chimed in my lobby. The ghosts of Boston stepped out into the light of my success. I knew the reckoning was coming, but I didn't expect them to bring a lawsuit as their opening move. They had come to collect a debt they thought I still owed for the privilege of my birth. They didn't realize that the ledger had been closed a long time ago. Monday, March 9th, 2026. My office on the 42nd floor in Bellevue is a cathedral of glass and steel. It is quiet here, the kind of expensive, intentional quiet that only comes from years of mastering global logistics. I have a Japanese maple in the corner that I prune myself, a collection of rare fountain pens, and a daughter, Mia, who is currently attending a private academy 3 miles away, safe and warm. Everything in this room is a testament to the fact that I exist. Yet, despite the success of Avon Logistics, there is a phantom pain that sits right between my ribs. I still find myself counting the chairs at my dining table, ensuring there are only 2. I still check the weather in Hartford every single morning at 6 a.m., even though I haven't spoken to a soul there in 2,312 days. In the top drawer of my mahogany desk, resting in a velvet-lined box, is Mia's pink plastic ER bracelet from 2019. It isn't a memento of a tragedy, it's a compass. It reminds me that character isn't defined by who claims you when you're winning, but by who abandons you when you're drowning. I was reviewing a shipment manifest for the Singapore route when my desk intercom chimed. It was Vance, my chief of security. His voice was unusually tight, a tone he reserved for breaches in protocol. "Vincent," he said, and the use of my name instead of ma'am told me the perimeter had already crumbled. "We have a situation at the lobby desk. 2 individuals bypassed the initial screening by claiming they were the founders and your primary emergency contacts. They are currently refusing to leave the reception area without a signature on a set of legal filings. They're making a scene, mentions of family duty, and mental instability." My heart didn't race. It went cold. I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like a captain whose ship was being boarded by ghosts. I realized then that I hadn't just been forgotten over these 7 years. I had been erased. And erasers only come back when they realize they missed a spot. "I'm coming down, Vance," I said. I didn't wait for the executive elevator to be sent up. I stood, straightened my charcoal blazer, and walked toward the bank of lifts. 42 floors. 28 seconds of gravity pressing me into the floor as the elevator descended. In the silence of that car, I adjusted my lapel. I was no longer the daughter who begged for a dry floor on a rainy Tuesday. I was the architect of a $30 million empire. At 10:15 a.m., the elevator doors hissed open. The lobby air smelled of rain and wet raincoats. Vance was standing near the mahogany reception counter, his hand hovering near his belt, his eyes locked on 2 figures sitting on the Italian leather sofa. Corvin looked older. His suit was expensive, likely a gift from Zinnia's dwindling boutique funds, but it was dated. Narina was beside him, clutching a designer handbag, a Chanel flap bag that I recognized from the Purse Shrine in Boston. They weren't looking for their daughter. They were looking at the marble floors, the digital ticker displaying our quarterly growth, and the gold leaf logo of Avon Logistics etched into the stone. They were measuring the drapes of a house they didn't build. I walked toward the guest check-in iPad on the counter. In the Reason for Visit column, Corvin had written in a jagged, arrogant hand, "Owner Reclamation." Corvin turned. He didn't look at my face. He didn't look for the girl he had kicked out into a flood. His eyes went straight to the gold-embossed badge clipped to my lapel. It read, "Vincent Calloway, founder and CEO." There was a collision of recognition in that moment. I saw his jaw tighten, his brain performing the rapid, greedy arithmetic of a man who realized he had discarded a winning lottery ticket 7 years too early. He didn't offer a hug. He didn't ask how Mia was. He gestured to the 50-foot vaulted ceiling and the glass walls. "Look at all this," Corvin said. His voice was the same judicial baritone, but it sounded thinner against the acoustics of my success. "It took a while, Vincent, but it seems my tough love parenting finally paid off. You've done well with the head start I gave you. It's a tragedy you've been so unwell that you forgot who provided the foundation for this dream." I didn't answer. I stood exactly 5 feet away, a measured professional distance. I watched a single drop of rain fall from his coat and hit my polished floor. I let the silence stretch for exactly 6 seconds, long enough for the smirk on his face to falter, long enough for Narina to shift uncomfortably in her seat. They hadn't come because they missed the daughter they erased. They came because the burden had turned into a mountain of capital, and they wanted their 35% tax for the air I breathed. Corvin reached into a thick manila envelope. "We should take this upstairs, Vincent. For the sake of the family legacy. There's a lawsuit drafted, but I'd prefer we handle this like the partners we are." I looked at the envelope, then back at the man who thought wool rugs were more precious than his grandchild. I didn't feel the need to shout. As the ancient proverb says, you cannot reason with someone who only sees you as a resource. I simply smiled. It was the smile of a woman who had already seen the bottom of the ocean and decided she was more comfortable there than in their parlor. The printer in the executive suite hummed a low industrial song, emitting the scent of warm ink and hot paper. It was a rhythmic, grounding sound. I wasn't preparing for a fight. I was preparing a ledger. In the world of logistics, an error in the manifest can sink a ship. In the world of families, an error in the narrative can sink a life. I spent the next hour sliding 3 hole-punched bank statements, high-resolution screenshots of the 2019 group chat, and the $50,000 forged loan documents into a heavy, black leather binder. I placed color-coded manila dividers between each section: 2012, 2014, 2019. My hands had a slight, electric tremor as I snapped the rings shut, not from a lack of courage, but from the sheer physical weight of the truth I had been carrying in silence for 7 years. Kyle stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, silhouetted against the gray Bellevue skyline. He was flipping through the final pages of the summary sheet. $218,000 in family support over 5 years, Kale said, his voice as sharp as a scalpel. And another $50,000 in identity theft. All while they sent you a digital death certificate the moment you asked for 2 hours of help. He closed the binder and looked at me. "They called you a burden, Vincent. But you were the only thing keeping their world from collapsing." "I was the capital, Kale," I replied quietly. "They just didn't want to admit the bank was run by the daughter they despised." "Let the paper do the talking now," he said. "Don't waste your breath where the ink has already dried." My phone vibrated on the mahogany desk. It was a text from a cousin in Boston I hadn't seen in a decade. "Vincent, Corvin is calling the whole family. He's telling everyone you had a total psychiatric breakdown in 2019 and that he's here in Seattle to save the company from your erratic behavior. He says you're hiding Mia from them. Be careful." It was a classic maneuver. Discredit the witness before she can take the stand. We moved from my private office to the executive boardroom. It was currently hosting a pre-investment reception for 20 of our primary shareholders. The room was a study in old money aesthetics, dark walnut panels, crystal decanters of aged scotch, and the soft, polite clink of silver on china. These people held my future in their hands. They valued stability above all else. As Kale and I entered, the atmosphere shifted. The sea of tailored suits didn't part with respect. It parted with a new, jagged edge of pity. Corvin had already been working the room. He was standing near the sideboard, a glass of scotch in one hand, looking every bit the concerned patriarch. Narina was beside him, her pearls shimmering under the chandeliers. Corvin approached me, his hand reaching out as if to pat my shoulder in a gesture of paternal comfort. "Vincent, dear," he said, his voice loud enough to catch the attention of the nearest board members. "You look strained. Are you feeling better?" We've been so worried about your stress levels since your episode 7 years ago. The burden of this company is clearly taking a toll." "I'm fine, Mr. Calloway," I said, stepping back to maintain the 5-foot perimeter. "Please keep your distance from the staff. We are in the middle of a professional reception." The use of his last name was a boundary he didn't expect. His smile sharpened, the concern in his eyes replaced by the cold arithmetic of a man who felt he was losing control of the floor. He stepped toward the center conference table and produced a thick manila envelope from his jacket. "We don't have to do this in front of everyone, Vincent," Corvin said, though his voice remained projected for the room. "But the family cannot sit by and watch you squander the legacy. I provided the initial capital for this dream. 35% is the family's fair share. Sign the transfer papers tonight, and we can provide the adult supervision this firm needs. Otherwise, we'll let the courts decide if an unstable woman should be at the helm of a logistics empire." Narina stepped forward, her eyes brimming with the kind of practiced tears she had used to manipulate me since I was a child. "Vincent, think of Mia," she whispered, her voice trembling. "She deserves to know her heritage. She deserves a family, not just a CEO. Don't let your greed keep her from the people who love her. Just sign, and we can go back to Sedona together. We can be a family again." I didn't argue. I didn't defend my sanity. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my iced coffee. I looked down at Narina's designer shoes I recognized from a boutique invoice I had paid in 2017. Money I had sent because she claimed she needed it for a medical emergency. I felt a profound, quiet clarity. The greed they spoke of was simply my refusal to remain their silent investor. Across the room, the board chairman, Arthur, a man of 80 who had survived 3 market crashes and a dozen corporate takeovers, caught my eye. He saw the black leather binder tucked under my arm. He saw the way I stood, still and unyielding, while my parents tried to carve pieces out of my character. He gave a single slow nod and stood up. The room went silent. The investors turned toward him, sensing the shift in gravity. Before Arthur could speak, Corvin sensed the loss of momentum. He lunged for the small podium at the front of the room, effectively stealing the floor. "Before our chairman makes his remarks," Corvin announced, his voice regaining its judicial thunder, "I think the stakeholders should know the truth about how Avon Logistics truly started. My daughter is a brilliant woman, but she is currently a danger to her own success. We have the documents to prove that her foundational capital came from the family estate, and we intend to reclaim what is ours." He reached for the microphone. I stood at the back of the room, my fingers tightening on the handle of the binder. He thought he was taking the stage. I let him. I wanted everyone to be watching when I finally opened the ledger and showed them what lived inside his 7 years of silence. The boardroom was a study in expensive optics. Dark mahogany panels, high-backed leather chairs that absorbed sound, and the faint, bitter scent of roasted Arabica mingling with old parchment. The HVAC system hummed a low, neutral note, a steady vibration that felt like the heartbeat of a machine. My potential investors, 12 men and women who held the keys to Avon Logistics expansion, sat in a semicircle, their faces unreadable, their pens poised over glass-topped tablets. Corvin stood at the head of the table. He had taken the podium with the practiced ease of a man who believed he was still on the bench delivering a verdict. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a theatrical, concerned whisper that carried to every corner of the room. "I don't take pleasure in this," Corvin said, glancing at Narina, who sat in the front row with a handkerchief pressed to her eyes. "But my daughter has been profoundly unwell since 2019. This company is a house of cards built on the foundational capital I provided from the family estate. Her current, erratic decisions, her isolation, they threaten the very assets you are looking to protect. We are not here to dismantle Avon Logistics. We are here to bring the adult supervision it so desperately needs." I sat at the far end of the long table, I hadn't touched my water. I wasn't looking at Corvin. I was watching the dust motes dance in a shaft of Bellevue sunlight that cut through the glass walls. I felt a strange, cold stillness. I realized that my family hadn't just come to Seattle to steal. They had come to perform. They were using my success as a stage for their own redemption arc. Arthur, the board chairman, tapped his fountain pen twice against the mahogany. The room went into a vacuum of silence. "Mr. Calloway, you speak of capital," Arthur said, his voice like granite. "Vincent, you have a binder. I believe it's time for the numbers to speak." I didn't stand up. I didn't need the height. I simply opened the black leather binder. The sound of the rings snapping open felt like a starting pistol. I slid 3 documents to the center of the table, letting them fan out like a deck of cards. "From 2014 to 2019, I said, my voice the same one I used for quarterly logistics manifests. I transferred a total of $218,450 to Corvin and Narina Calloway. Every dollar is tracked here, labeled in their own messages as family support. There was no initial capital provided to me. I was the capital. I was the silent partner in a family that only valued my presence when it was liquid." I slid the second document forward, the credit audit Cale had performed. "In 2018, a $50,000 business loan was taken in my name without my consent. The signature is a digital forgery. The funds were used to pay for Zinnia Calloway's failed boutique lease in Boston. I spent 2 years of my life in Seattle paying off that debt while I was eating on a mattress on the floor." Corvin's face began to redden, a blotchy, angry color that matched his silk tie. "That's a lie. That was a family arrangement." I didn't argue. I placed my phone on the table and pressed a single button. "This is the tough love," Corvin mentioned. "This is why I disappeared." The recording from November 2019 filled the room. Corvin's voice, crackling but unmistakable, echoed off the glass walls. "You can't bring a wet child in those moldy bags in here, Vincent. The wool rugs were replaced yesterday. This house isn't a warehouse for your disasters. Find a hotel." The air in the boardroom changed. It didn't just get cold, it became heavy. One by one, the board members leaned back, creating a physical, measurable distance from Corvin and Narina. Narina's hand went to her throat, her eyes darting to the exit. She finally saw that the audience they had assembled was no longer a theater. It was a jury. "That's ancient history!" Corvin shouted, his composure finally fracturing. He slammed his hand on the podium. "You still owe us for the roof over your head back in Boston, for the years we raised you. You can't just erase your origins because you got lucky with some trucks." I slid the final document toward him. It was a deed of trust with a bright red county seal. "Actually, Corvin, you owe me," I said quietly. "You defaulted on the Hartford house last year after Zinnia's boutique went under. You thought the bank was just being lenient. They weren't. I bought the note through a holding company 12 months ago. I didn't want strangers to own the house where I grew up, so I became your landlord. You've been living in my warehouse for a year, rent-free." I stood up for the first time. I looked at them, not with anger, but with the weary clarity of someone looking at a book that has finally been closed. "I am not 19 anymore," I said. "And I am not standing in the rain. I do not owe you 35% of my life for the misfortune of being born into your ranking system. You erased me 7 years ago. Today, I am simply making that erasure legal. My attorney will handle the eviction notice for the Hartford property. You have 30 days to find a new place for your wool rugs. We are finished." I didn't wait for a response. I closed the black binder with a soft, final click. The room was so quiet I could hear the sharp, panicked intake of Corvin's breath. I set my glass of water down, perfectly centered on its coaster, and walked toward the door. Corvin was left standing at a podium that no longer held any power, in a room full of people who finally saw him for what he was, an intruder. The silence didn't feel like a weapon. It felt like a border. And for the first time in 34 years, the border was secure. The silence in the boardroom was oxygen-deprived. It wasn't a moment of triumph. It was a moment of absolute, clinical clarity. Corvin stood at the podium, his fingers fumbling with his silk tie, but the authority that had sustained his posture for decades had evaporated. He looked toward Arthur, but the chairman simply turned his leather chair toward the Bellevue skyline. My father had become a liability, a glitch in a system that valued precision. I stood by the glass wall, feeling the faint vibration of the city 42 floors below. I didn't feel like I had won a war. I just felt like I had finally finished a very long, very exhausting audit. The people in this room no longer saw a patriarch. They saw an intruder who had been caught in the act. I looked at Narina, whose handkerchief was now a crumpled ball in her lap. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at the exit. I picked up the desk phone without looking at them. My voice was the same one I used for quarterly logistics projections. Neutral, efficient, and final. Vance? We have 2 unauthorized individuals in boardroom 42. They are disrupting a scheduled meeting. Please escort them to the street and ensure their visitor badges are deactivated immediately. Corvin's mouth opened, a silent, fish-like protest, but Vance was already through the door. There was no physical struggle. The weight of the shame was too heavy for resistance. I watched their reflections in the glass as they were led out past the employees who had once been told they were the founders. In the lobby, an old family friend, now an Avon investor, didn't stop them to say hello. He just shook his head and looked at the floor as they passed. The narrative they had spent 7 years building had collapsed under the weight of a single black binder. 6 months later, a Saturday morning in Bellevue. The air smells of pine needles and sea salt. The Hartford house is gone, sold to a family who needed a home, not a monument to vanity. The proceeds are sitting in a trust for Mia's education, locked behind a legal wall Corvin can never climb. Zinnia sent a 3,000-word email last week, blaming me for the downfall of the Callaway name. I didn't respond. I didn't even feel the urge to correct her. I sat at my desk and opened the velvet-lined box. I took out Mia's pink plastic hospital bracelet from 2019. I looked at the faded ink of her name. I didn't need it as a compass anymore, because I was no longer lost. I dropped the plastic into the shredder and watched the teeth turn the memory into confetti. I am no longer the provider, the tool, or the practical daughter. I am no longer defined by the ranking system of a house that valued rugs over people. If you are currently carrying the weight of a family that only loves you when you are convenient, I want you to know something. You can set it down. The world won't end. It will just finally begin to move in the right direction. I looked at the empty drawer and smiled. My parents spent 7 years acting like I didn't exist. Now, for the first time in my life, I finally do.